I didn't hear my grandson cry. I heard him apologize. "I'm sorry." Those were the first words I caught as I rounded the corner toward our table with a handful of birthday balloons I'd forgotten in my truck. For a second, I actually smiled. I figured he'd knocked over a glass or stepped on somebody's foot. Kids apologize for little things all the time. Then I looked up. Frank, my son-in-law's father, had one hand twisted into the front of Ethan's shirt. The other was pushing him backward. Ethan's shoulder hit the wall hard enough to make the framed picture swing crooked. The whole restaurant went quiet. Frank let go, adjusted his sleeve, sat back down, like he'd just moved a chair that was in his way. Nobody said a word. Not my daughter, not Brian, not even Linda. She looked at Ethan, smiled, and said, "Good. Maybe now he'll think before he acts." I stood there holding 3 blue balloons like an idiot. One of them slipped out of my hand and bounced against the ceiling. Nobody looked at it. Everybody was looking at Ethan, except Ethan. He was looking at the floor. That's the first thing that bothered me. Kids usually look at whoever scared them. He didn't. He stared at the carpet like he already knew what came next. I walked over and picked up the little paper birthday hat lying beside his shoe. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded without looking at me. "You sure?" Another nod. Then, barely above a whisper, I spilled his tea. I looked at the table disdain. The glass was still standing. There was maybe a tablespoon of iced tea near Frank's plate. Nothing on his clothes, nothing on the floor, just a wet napkin. I turned toward Frank. He shrugged. Consequences. That was the only explanation he offered. For about 2 seconds, I forgot Ethan was standing behind me. I started toward Frank. Brian stepped between us, not aggressively, almost automatically. "Dad," then he caught himself. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Frank. "Dad, please." It wasn't the word please that caught my attention. It was the tone. I've heard that tone before. Years ago. From soldiers, from abused spouses, from people trying to stop something before it gets worse. Frank didn't even look at Brian. He reached for another dinner roll. "Sit down." Brian did. Without arguing, without thinking, just sat down. That was the moment I stopped seeing one angry old man. Something much older was sitting at that table. Something nobody wanted to name. The waitress hurried over. She asked if Ethan needed ice. Linda smiled at her. "Oh, he's fine. He just gets dramatic." The waitress didn't answer. She looked at Ethan, then at me. I quietly said, "Could you ask your manager to come over?" She nodded and disappeared. Frank chuckled. "What, you're reporting me because the kid can't stand straight?" I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and called exactly one person. The phone rang once. "Hello, it's happening again." Silence. Then the voice on the other end asked, "Is the boy there?" "Yes. I'm leaving now." The call ended. 20 seconds, maybe less. Frank leaned back in his chair. "You calling the cops?" "No." "A lawyer?" "No." "Then who?" I slid the phone back into my pocket. "You'll find out." For the first time since I'd walked in, Frank looked uncertain, only for a second, but I saw it in H. The manager arrived. Young guy, calm, professional. He asked if everyone was all right. Before anybody answered, Frank spoke. The kid bumped into me. Grandpa corrected him. The manager looked at Ethan, then at the table, then back at Frank. "I'd still like to document what happened." Frank frowned. "For what?" "So there's an accurate record. Record. Interesting word." Frank laughed. "You people write reports over everything now." The manager didn't respond. Instead, he turned to me. "Sir, our cameras recorded the dining room. I'll make sure the footage is preserved." I hadn't asked him to. Not yet. I simply nodded. "Thank you." Frank's smile disappeared. Not because of the cameras, because the manager had made that decision on his own. That's when I noticed something else. Brian hadn't looked at his father in almost 5 minutes. He hadn't looked at me either. He was watching Ethan. Not to comfort him, to see if he was about to say something. That look stayed with me, because it wasn't the expression of a guilty father. It was the expression of a man waiting for a secret to finally come out. And I had the feeling, this birthday dinner wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the first time the rest of us had accidentally walked into the middle of it. I asked the manager if Ethan and I could wait somewhere quieter while he finished his report. He pointed us toward a small hallway near the front office. There was a wooden bench against the wall. A vending machine humming in the corner. Nothing special. Funny the things you remember. Ethan sat beside me, still holding the little plastic dinosaur that had come with his kid's meal. One of its legs had snapped off. He kept rubbing the broken edge with his thumb. I didn't ask him any questions. "Not yet." Kids deserve at least one adult who doesn't treat every conversation like an interrogation. After a minute or two, he looked up. Grandpa? Yeah, buddy? Are we still gonna do cake? I smiled. If you want to. He thought about it, then shook his head. Maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow. Like birthdays could simply be postponed. I nodded. Tomorrow it is. The hallway door opened. Brian stepped in alone. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a second. He looked exhausted, not from what had happened, from something that looked years older. I'm sorry, he said. I waited. He looked at Ethan. I'm really sorry. Ethan nodded. That bothered me. Children forgive too quickly when they're used to disappointing adults. Brian crouched down. You want to ride home with Grandpa? Can I? Brian looked at me. Would that be okay? Of course. He nodded, but he didn't stand up right away. He stayed there looking at Ethan like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he quietly asked, Did you tell him? Ethan shook his head. No. Brian closed his eyes. Just for a second. Then he stood and walked back toward the dining room. I watched him go. That was the second time I'd heard those words that night. Did you tell him? Tell me what? A few minutes later, the manager came back. He handed me a business card with his name written on the back. If anyone needs a statement later, he said, call me directly. I appreciate that. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. I've worked here 6 years. Okay? I've broken up arguments. I've seen people throw punches. This, he glanced toward the dining room, didn't look like somebody losing their temper. I didn't answer. He continued. It looked practiced. That word followed me all the way to the truck. Practiced. Because that's exactly how it had felt. Not explosive. Routine. On the drive home, Ethan sat quietly looking out the window. About 10 minutes passed before he spoke. Grandpa? Yeah? If somebody says they're sorry first, do grown-ups get less mad? I felt my hands tighten around the steering wheel. Why do you ask? He shrugged. It works sometimes. Sometimes. I didn't push him. I simply said, you never have to apologize before you've done something wrong. He looked confused. What if they're already mad? I didn't answer right away, because I realized he wasn't asking about tonight. He was asking about life. When we got to my house, I asked if he wanted to help me feed the birds in the backyard. He loved doing that when he was younger. He smiled. Okay. For the next half hour, we didn't talk about Frank. We filled bird feeders. We argued over whether squirrels were clever or just greedy. He laughed when one squirrel scared another off the fence. For a little while, he looked like a 9-year-old again. Then my phone buzzed. One text message. Just 3 words. I'm outside. The person I'd called had arrived. I looked through the kitchen window. An old blue pickup was parked at the curb. Ethan saw it too. His shoulders relaxed. Jack's here. I looked at him. You know Jack? He nodded. I met him before. That wasn't the answer I expected. I stepped onto the front porch. Jack got out of his truck, carrying nothing but a small notebook. We'd known each other for more than 25 years. Most people knew him as a retired elementary school principal. That wasn't the reason I'd called him. Years before becoming a principal, he'd spent nearly 2 decades as a child advocate working with schools whenever there were concerns about abuse or neglect. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't a therapist. He was the person schools called when something didn't quite make sense yet. He shook my hand, then looked through the screen door at Ethan. He remembers me. I nodded slowly. So he wasn't meeting you for the first time. Jack looked surprised. You didn't know? No. He frowned. I assumed Brian told you. He told me what? Jack went quiet, long enough that I heard kids playing basketball somewhere down the block. Finally, he said, I can't discuss confidential conversations. I understand, but I can tell you this. He looked me straight in the eye. This wasn't the first time someone at Ethan's school became worried. I felt the porch suddenly seem very small. Worried enough to do what? Worried enough to ask for help. Before I could ask another question, the front door opened. Ethan walked outside carrying the broken dinosaur. He smiled at Jack. I still have him. Jack smiled back. I see that. Ethan held up the toy. I fixed his tail with glue. Jack looked at me for a moment, then back at Ethan. You always were good at fixing broken things. Ethan answered without thinking. I try. Those 2 words hit me harder than anything Frank had said all night. Because children aren't supposed to believe it's their job to fix broken adults. Jack waited until Ethan went back inside. Then he quietly said, There's something Brian never finished telling us. What? He took a slow breath. The school opened a concern file last year. I stared at him. A concern file? He nodded. It was closed before we could complete it. Who closed it? Jack looked toward my house. I don't know, but I think He stopped. No. I'd rather show you than guess. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out an envelope with my grandson's name written across the front. Jack held the envelope for a second before handing it to me. You should open it inside. There wasn't anything dramatic about the way he said it. If anything, he sounded tired, like he'd had this conversation before with other families. We sat at my kitchen table after Ethan went upstairs to wash the frosting off his birthday shirt. Jack slid the envelope toward me. It's a copy. Of what? The school's concern file. I looked at him. I thought you said it was closed. It was, but the records weren't destroyed. I opened the envelope. The first page wasn't what I expected. No accusations, no medical reports, just a teacher's observation. Ethan apologizes before being corrected. Frequently asks if adults are upset with him. Appears unusually anxious after weekends away from home. I turn the page. Another teacher, different month. Student startles when adults raise their voices, even if unrelated to him. Another page. The school nurse. Complained of stomach aches almost every Monday morning. No physical illness found. I stopped reading. Every note, by itself, sounded small. Together, they painted a picture none of us had seen. Jack pointed to the last page. At the bottom was one sentence. Recommended follow-up meeting with parents. Underneath it, in red ink, meeting canceled at family's request. I looked up. Who canceled it? Jack shook his head. I don't know. The records don't say. My phone rang before either of us spoke again. It was Brian, I answered. His voice was barely above a whisper. Dad, I need to come over. When he arrived 20 minutes later, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. He saw the envelope on the table. Then he saw Jack. He closed his eyes. So you found it? I asked him one question. Who canceled the meeting? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the sink, poured himself a glass of water, and stood there staring out the window. Finally, he turned around. I did. The room went quiet. Jack looked as surprised as I was. You? Brian nodded. I signed the cancellation. I couldn't understand it. Why? He laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. My mother came to our house. She told us if the school got involved, they'd try to take Ethan away. He rubbed both hands across his face. I believed her. Jack asked quietly. Did you believe that? Or did you believe your father would find out? Brian looked at him, then down at the floor. My father. There it was. The truth he'd spent years walking around. He wasn't protecting Frank. He was still afraid of him, even as a grown man. My daughter arrived a little later. Brian had called her on the way over. She listened while Jack explained what the teachers had documented. She didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she asked Brian, "Why didn't you tell me?" Brian reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn around the edges. He handed it to her. I carried this every day. She unfolded it. It was a business card. The back had one sentence written in Brian's handwriting. If I don't stop this now, Ethan becomes me. She looked at him. You wrote this? The day I met Jack. Then why didn't you stop it? Brian's answer was so quiet I almost missed it. Because every time I tried, I heard my father's voice before I heard my own. Nobody in the room spoke after that. Not for almost a minute. Sometimes silence tells the truth better than words. Jack finally stood. My job here is finished. I walked him to the front door. Before leaving, he said something that changed the way I thought about that entire year. I've met hundreds of children like Ethan. I waited. The ones who recover aren't always the strongest. They are the ones who discover, early enough, that at least one adult will believe them. He looked back toward the kitchen where Ethan was laughing at something my daughter had said. You became that adult tonight. After he left, life didn't magically become easy. It became honest. My daughter and Brian entered family counseling. Brian started individual therapy for the first time in his life. Not because a court ordered it, because he finally admitted he was still living with a frightened little boy inside him. The investigation into the restaurant incident continued. The surveillance video, the manager's report, the witness statements, the school records. None of them alone told the whole story. Together they did. Months later, the court issued a long-term order preventing Frank from having unsupervised contact with Ethan. Frank appealed. The judge reviewed everything again. The decision didn't change. Frank never apologized, not once. The last message he left Brian was only 6 words. You'll regret choosing them over me. Brian deleted it without replying. That was the first time he'd ever ended one of his father's conversations. A year later, Ethan asked if we could celebrate his birthday at the same restaurant. I asked if he was sure. He grinned. I don't want him to own my favorite place. So we went. Same restaurant, same booth. The manager came over and shook Ethan's hand. The waitress remembered him. She brought out another chocolate lava cake. Halfway through dinner, Ethan accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice. The whole table froze, just for a heartbeat. Then Brian grabbed a stack of napkins, laughed, and said, "I think the table needed a drink." Everyone laughed, even Ethan. He looked around the table for a second, then he smiled at me. "Grandpa? Yeah? I forgot to say sorry." I smiled back. "You didn't have anything to apologize for." He looked at the spilled juice, then back at me. "I know. That one sentence told me more than any court order ever could." On the drive home, I realized something. The most important phone call I made that night wasn't important because of who answered. It mattered because, for the first time in Ethan's life, someone answered him. And after all these years, that's the only victory I ever needed.